Okay, welcome to the second session on the actual reading of The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. We left off last time talking about the various ways that the bourgeois order takes the revolutionary movements of the working classes and dashes and tricks and destroys them. And we also talked about the way that these things, they don't change, right? The tactics haven't changed because they keep on working. And the only way to stop them from working is by building a disciplined, principled working class movement. Ideally a party structure because we want to avoid spontaneity and so on and so forth. It talks about the need to educate the whole of the workers, which Engels talked about in his introduction, which preceded this stuff. Those written many years later. The need for the working class as a whole to all be educated. Now, for our last section, we did get some information regarding what Marx and Engels had in mind for the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, in particular, we learned that the working class's revolutionary uprising necessarily will abolish bourgeois credit, as it abolishes bourgeois production and all the bases for it to exist. Quote, public credit and private credit are the economic thermometer by which the intensity of a revolution can be measured. The more they fall, the more the fervor and generative power of the revolution rises. In other words, you can tell a counter-revolutionary movement, example fascism, in that as they actually rise, the credit and whatnot rises as well. The bourgeoisie know their own class interests and the threat to them, and they will attempt to withhold finance to attempt to stop a movement that they are threatened by. We also went over a couple of the old hat tactics that are still in use today. These are including, but not limited to, playing parts of the proletariat against one another, creating militias of far-right young men sold on nationalism and whatnot, creating busy work for the proletariat so they can't think about or physically engage in organizing. This was in reference to the workhouses. Give concessions only when under direct physical threat, and those concessions being designed so it has no capacity to meaningfully affect anything, and thereby making it so the working class is in disarray because whenever they engage in any serious movement or anything like that, because they can't ever really fully go through it, what ends up happening is, well, we did all that work, but nothing changed. I guess it's just life, right? And then shaming violent revolutionary actions, despite that being the only right they can afford, the working class, as all others are kept from. So think that old Kennedy quote where he's like, what is it? Kennedy quote about democracy. I don't remember, but basically he said that if you don't engage, actually screw it, I have it in the UMP line because it's actually a good one. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Peaceful revolution is exactly the thing that they remove from us, that they say cannot happen, that they disallow from their political sphere. So what is the only thing that we can do? What is the only right that's afforded to us? Revolution. That's the only act that's afforded to us. And it's the only material right that any class has. That said, we are going to continue. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to finish the whole of Part 1, The Defeat of June 1848. If we care to, we might do a post-production wherein we actually release a combined a combined video thing for this section and then see about getting the rest of the sessions put together. I don't know. We'll see how it works. In the meantime, let's get started. On May 4th, the National Assembly, and this has a footnote. The Constituent National Assembly in power from May 4, 1848 to May 1849 met the result of the direct general elections convened. And I'm sorry, let me share this so that you guys can come in here and make comments if you like. Universal suffrage did not possess the magic power which Republicans of old school had ascribed to it. They saw in the whole of France, at least in the majority of Frenchmen, citizens with the same interests, the same understanding, etc. This was their cult of the people. Instead of their imaginary people, the elections brought the real people to the light of day, that is, representatives of the different classes into which it falls. We have seen why peasants and Petit-Bourgeois had to vote under the leadership of the Bourgeoisie spoiling for a fight, and of the big landowners frantic for restoration. But if universal suffrage was not the miracle, working magic wand the Republican worthies had taken it for, it possessed the incomparable higher merit of unchaining the class struggle, of letting the various middle strata of bourgeois society rapidly get over their illusions and disappointments, of tossing all the sections of the exploiting class at one throw to the apex of the state, and thus tearing from them their receptive mask. Whereas the monarchy with its property qualifications had let only certain factions of the bourgeoisie compromise themselves, allowing the others to lie hidden behind the scenes and surrounding them with the halo of a common opposition. In the constituent national assemblies, which met on May 4th, the bourgeois Republicans, the Republicans of the National, had the upper hand. Even legitimists and Orleanists at first dared to show themselves only under the mask of bourgeois republicanism. The fight against the proletariat could be undertaken only in the name of the Republic. The Republic dates from May 4, not from February 25th. That is, the Republic recognized by the French people. It is not the Republic which the Paris proletariat thrust upon the provisional government, nor the Republic with social institutions, not the vision that hovered between the fighters on the barricades. The Republic proclaimed by the National Assembly, the sole legitimate Republic, is a Republic which is no revolutionary weapon against the bourgeois order, but rather its political reconstitution, the political reconsolidation of bourgeois society. In a word, a bourgeois republic. This contention resounded from the tribune of the National Assembly. In the entire Republican and anti-Republican bourgeois press, it found its echo. And we have seen how the February Republic in reality was not and could not be other than a bourgeois republic. How the provisional government, nevertheless, was forced by the immediate pressure of the proletariat to announce it as a republic with social institutions. How the Paris proletariat was still incapable of going beyond a bourgeois republic otherwise than in its fancy, in imagination. How even where the republic acted in the service of the bourgeoisie when it really came to action. How the promises made to it became an unbearable danger for the new republic. How the whole life process of the provisional government was compromised in a continuous fight against the demands of the proletariat. So, this is the same thing that Lenin talked about in his various works on the Narodniks, right? The bourgeois republic is seeking universal suffrage. It's part of their revolutionary movement. It's part of the ideology that's embedded within bourgeois society. It's a progressive one, a very progressive one, to be clear. However, the problem is that capitalist society fundamentally is only the democracy for the bourgeoisie and their class interests. And therefore, even though their ideology requires them to see all individuals as equal and all individuals as having the capacity to engage in society in this way, For them, some people are more equal than others, and the people who are of their class enemies must be silenced. This is a problem with ultra-democratic trends and the sort of that sort of stuff, right? Because what ends up happening is the bourgeoisie, they have their revolutions. Great. The monarchy is overthrown. The feudal order is kicked to the curb. But then what happens? The proletariat, who were the major people, the proletarian peasants for that matter, who were the major people involved in the actual revolutionary movements, suddenly start making all sorts of demands of their new democracy. Because they're like, hey, we had the right to the vote. We fought for the right to vote. We established it. So what does the bourgeoisie have to do? They have to align with the previous monarchy and landowner and feudal remnants and crush the attempts at actually the working class utilizing that democracy in any form. And so the history of bourgeois democracy is one in which it is a continual development of tactics in order to suppress the capacity of their class enemies, utilizing the tool that they had created for their own overthrow of the feudal order. This is the history of bourgeois democracy. It is the democracy of the slave owners. It's the democracy of the monarchy. It is the democracy of the bourgeoisie. This is why we call this the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Continuing. In the National Assembly, all France sat in judgment upon the Paris proletariat. The Assembly broke immediately with the social illusions of the February Revolution. It roundly proclaimed the Bourgeois Republic, nothing but the Bourgeois Republic. It at once excluded the representatives of the proletariat, Louis Blanc and Albert, from the Executive Commission it had appointed. And there's a footnote here. The Executive Commission, the government of the French Republic set up by the Constituent Assembly on May 10, 1848, to replace the provisional government which had resigned. It existed until June 24, 1848, when French name's dictatorship was established during the June proletarian uprising. Moderate Republicans predominated on the commission. Ledru-Rollin was the sole representative of the left. It threw out the proposal of a special labor ministry and received with acclamation to the statement of Minister Trelat, quote, "The question now is merely one of bringing labor back to its old conditions." But all this was not enough. The February Republic was won by the workers with the passive support of the bourgeoisie. The proletarians rightly regarded themselves as the victors of February, and they had made the arrogant claims of victors. They had to be vanquished in the streets. They had to be shown that they were worsted as soon as they did not fight with the bourgeoisie, but against the bourgeoisie. Just as the February Republic, with its socialist concessions, required a battle of the proletariat united with the bourgeoisie against the monarchy, so a second battle was necessary to sever the Republic from socialist concessions, to officially work out the Bourgeois Republic as dominant. The bourgeoisie had to refute, arms in hand, the demands of the proletariat. And the real birthplace of the Bourgeois Republic is not the February victory, it is the June defeat. The proletariat hastened the decision when, on the 15th of May, it pushed its way into the National Assembly, sought in vain to recapture its revolutionary influence, and only developed its energetic leaders to the jailers of the bourgeoisie. Il faut en finir. This situation must end. With this cry, the National Assembly gave vent to its determination to force the proletariat into a decisive struggle. The Executive Commission issued a series of provocative decrees, such as that of prohibiting congregations of people, etc. And there is a footnote here. Under the decree prohibiting congregations of people adopted by the Constituent Assembly on June 7, 1848, the organization of gatherings and meetings in the open was punishable by imprisonment of up to 10 years. This is the kind of stuff that is the most pure example of class warfare, right? Where they recognize the threat. And so they recognize that, it's through solidarity, it's through organization, it's through collective action that the working class has its power, that any class has its power. And so they attempt to stop it from ever occurring. Now, such heavy-handed methods really won't work. But they'll try despite. Continuing. The workers were directly provoked, insulted, and derided from the tribune of the Constituent National Assembly. But the real point of the attack was, as we have seen, the national ateliers, that is, the workshops. The Constituent Assembly imperiously pointed these out to the Executive Commission, which waited only to hear its own plan proclaimed the command of the National Assembly. The Executive Commission began by making admission to national workshops more difficult, by turning the day wage into a piece wage. So, in other words, rather than you're paid by the hour or day, instead you're paid by the amount that you produce within that given period. Right. And Marx talks in detail about these and the distinctions between them and their ultimate similarities in his Wage, Labor, and Capital. By banishing workers not born in Paris to Salon, ostensibly for the construction of earthworks. These earthworks were only a rhetorical formula with which to embellish their exile as the workers, returning disillusioned, announced to their comrades. Finally, on June 21st, a decree appeared in the Moniteur which ordered the forcible expulsion of all unmarried workers from the workshops or their enrollment in the army. Okay, and there is a footnote here. On June 22nd, 1848, Le Moniteur Universel, number 174 from the section Partie non officielle, reported an order of the Executive Commission on June 21st on the expulsion of workers between ages of 17 and 25 from the national workshops and their compulsory enrollment in the army. On July 3, 1848, after the suppression of the June insurrection of the Paris workers, the government passed a decree dissolving the national workshops. Continuing, the workers were left no choice. They had to starve or let fly. They answered on June 22nd with the tremendous insurrection in which the first great battle was fought between the two classes that split modern society. It was a fight for the preservation or annihilation of the bourgeois order. The veil that shrouded the republic was torn asunder. In other words, at this point, the working class had finally, fully realized that they were in a class struggle against the bourgeoisie. Despite all the attempts by the bourgeoisie to say, no, we're all in this together. We're all fighting against the monarchy equally. Your class collaboration. No. The working class had had enough. They had realized the severity and the reality of the situation, and their spontaneous class interests emerged. It is well known how the workers, with unexampled bravery and ingenuity, without leaders, without a common plan, without means, and for the most part lacking weapons, held in check for 5 days the army, the Mobile Guard, the Paris National Guard, and the National Guard that streamed in from the provinces. It is well known how the bourgeoisie compensated itself for the mortal anguish it suffered by unheard of brutality, massacring over 3,000 prisoners. The official representatives of French democracy were steeped in Republican ideology to such an extent that it was only some weeks later that they began to have an inkling of the significance of the June fight. They were stupefied by the gunpowder smoke in which their fantastic republic dissolved. The immediate impression which the news of the June defeat made on us, the reader will allow us to describe in the words of the Neue Zeitung. And there's a footnote, Marx's article, in the newspaper, from which he quotes here, appears on pages 147 150. Quote, the executive committee, and we're skipping down apparently. No, that doesn't make sense. Let's see. File no longer available. RIP. Okay. The executive committee, that last official vestige of the February Revolution, vanished like a ghost in the face of these grave events. Lamartine's fireworks had turned into the incendiary shells of Cavaignac. Fraternity, the brotherhood of antagonistic classes, one of which exploits the other. This fraternity, which in February was proclaimed and inscribed in large letters on the facades of Paris, on every prison and every barracks, this fraternity found its true, unadulterated, and prosaic expression in civil war. Civil war in its most terrible aspect, the war of labor against capital. This brotherhood blazed in front of the windows of Paris on the evening of June 25th, when the Paris of the bourgeoisie held illuminations, while the Paris of the proletariat was burning, bleeding, groaning in the throes of death. This fraternity lasted only as long as there was a consanguinity of interests between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Pedants sticking to the old revolutionary tradition of 1793, socialist doctrinaires who begged alms for the people from the bourgeoisie and who were allowed to deliver lengthy sermons and compromise themselves so long as the proletarian lion had to be lulled to sleep. Republicans who wanted to keep the old bourgeois order in toto, but without the crowned head. Members of the dynastic opposition. I'm going to guess this footnote does not exist either. It does not. On whom chance imposed the task of bringing about the downfall of a dynasty instead of a change of government. Legitimists, who did not want to cast off their livery, but merely to change its style. These were the allies with whom the people had fought the February Revolution. What the people instinctively hated in Louis-Philippe was not Louis-Philippe himself, but the crowned rule of a class, the capital on the throne. But magnanimous as always, the people thought that they had destroyed their enemy when they had overthrown the enemy of their enemies, their common enemy. You still see this in fiction, right? I don't know how many times you've seen people say, if only we had like aliens come down and fight us and all the world would get together and we'd fight our common enemy and there would be peace among people. You'll see people claim that. And it's true, for a time you would have that. But even within that, you've got one class exploiting the other, right? Even within that. Such a peace is false. It doesn't exist. Justice is what is needed for peace to exist. You cannot have an unjust peace. You cannot have an unjust relation and expect things to, not produce these problems. It is only when you get rid of exploitation and create real justice that there exists actual peace. Still, though, this continues to be bandied about as if it's a thing that can happen under current order. Quote, the February Revolution was a nice revolution. The revolution of universal sympathies, because the contradictions which erupted in it against the monarchy were still undeveloped and peacefully dormant, because the social struggle which formed their background had only achieved an ephemeral existence, an existence in phrases, in words. The June Revolution is the ugly revolution, the nasty revolution, because the phrases had given place to the real thing. Because the Republic had bared the head of the monster by knocking off the crown which shielded and concealed it. Order was Guizot's war cry. Order, shouted Sebastiani, the Guizotist, when Warsaw became Russian. Order, shouted Cavaignac, the brutal echo of the French National Assembly and the Republican or Bourgeois. Order, thundered his grape shot as it tore into the body of the proletariat. Law and order, am I right? That common right-wing war cry, law and order. We need law and order in society, as if law and order can exist in an exploitative relation. It's a cry that the slaves should obey their masters. That's all it ever is, and all it ever will be. None of the numerous revolutions of the French bourgeoisie since 1789 assailed the existing order, for they retained the class rule, the slavery of the workers. The bourgeois system, even though the political form of this rule and slavery changed frequently, the June Uprising did assail the system. Woe to the June Uprising. Woe to that June re-echoes Europe. So this is the end of his quotations from his previous article. The Paris proletariat was forced into the June insurrection by the bourgeoisie. This sufficed to mark its doom. Its immediate avowed needs did not drive it to engage in a fight for the forcible overthrow of the bourgeoisie, nor was it equal to its task. The Moniteur had to inform it officially that the time was past when the Republic saw any occasion to bow and scrape to its illusions, and only its defeat convinced it of the truth that the slightest improvement in its position remains a utopia within the bourgeois republic, a utopia that becomes a crime as soon as it wants to become a reality. In place of the demands, exuberant in form but still limited, and even bourgeois in content, whose concession to the proletariat wanted to wring from the February Republic, there appeared this bold slogan for revolutionary struggle: overthrow of the bourgeoisie, dictatorship of the working class. I'm going to copy this and first reference to the DOTP comment, and we're posting it in our own thing. So, what's being said here, right? This is actually very similar to the German Revolution. Quote unquote, the German Revolution, when the Spartacus uprising occurred. Ultimately, this was not kick-started by the actual socialists. It was kick-started by their class enemies, the Social Democrats, the bourgeoisie. They understood that the militant movements were not ready, and so they took advantage of that fact. And they kickstarted it so they would be able to crack down on it. CCK philosophy or Cuck philosophy and Bess D. Marx both have wonderful video series on this topic. I'll see if I can get you guys those links after this. But if you are at all interested, please check them out. They are long though. But in short, right, starting a revolutionary movement in a certain sense is not difficult. What's needed ultimately is a crisis of legitimacy of the state. It brought down the USSR, right? There's a crisis of legitimacy and the people rose up against it. What is difficult, though, is making it stick. Turning that revolutionary, spontaneous struggles into something that is actually productive. That is a factor of, militant, disciplined organizing. You never want to kickstart your revolutionary movement too soon. Nor do you want to start it too late either. It's a very much strike when the iron is hot sort of thing. Because if you do it too late, then you're in a situation where the working class gets antsy. And in fact, that's a situation where fascism most thrives, as has occurred in Italy, for instance. Because fascism comes in and offers, hey, we are actually revolutionary, when they're not. It's a fake revolution, astroturfed by the bourgeoisie or factions of it, and taking advantage of the fact that people are wanting fundamentally something new. So it is our duty to create a crisis of legitimacy for our bourgeois nations, but we only want to do so when we are in a position with which to take advantage of it. And that means having a disciplined, organized, militant working class party with a diversity of tactics that it's engaging in order to engage in propaganda outlets, developing dual power, and so on and so forth. Nexarino hopefully will be able to come in later and talk about and do sessions of his own talking about this. I know that he is organizing. So yes, a vanguard party is one of these things, right? Vanguard parties aren't the only ones that engage in that. A vanguard party is a group of professional, full-time revolutionaries who engage in political propaganda and struggle. What is important here is that they are full-time and they're professional. So essentially, your party organization has to maintain their existence. They have to pay for them to go and travel, to have food, to protect them, and so on and so forth. These people are necessarily underground. They're going to be engaging in a legal struggle as well, though we want to avoid any liquidationist tendencies. Again, Nexarino hopefully will go into detail about that, and I will certainly attend his sessions on that. Continuing. By making its burial place the birthplace of the bourgeois republic, the proletariat compelled the latter to come out forthwith in its pure form as a state whose admitted object is to perpetuate the rule of capital, the slavery of labor, having constantly before its eyes a scarred, irreconcilable, invincible enemy, invincible because its existence is a condition of its own life. Bourgeois rule, freed from all fetters, was bound to turn immediately into bourgeois terrorism. The dictatorship of the proletariat fellows. With the proletariat removed for the time being from the stage and the bourgeois dictatorship recognized officially, the middle strata of bourgeois society, the petty bourgeoisie and the peasant class, had to adhere more and more closely to the proletariat as their position became more unbearable and their antagonism to the bourgeoisie more acute. Just as earlier they had to find the cause of their distrust in its upsurge, so now in its defeat. If the June insurrection became the self-assurance of the bourgeoisie all over the continent and caused it to league itself openly with the feudal monarchy against the people, whose the first victim of this alliance is the continental bourgeoisie itself. The June defeat prevented it from consolidating its rule and bringing the people, half satisfied and half out of humor, to a standstill at the lowest stage of the bourgeois revolution. Finally, the defeat of June divulged to the despotic powers of Europe the secret that France must maintain peace abroad at any price in order to be able to wage civil war at home. Thus, the peoples who had begun the fight for their national independence were abandoned to the superior power of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. But at the same time, the fate of these national revolutions was made subject to the fate of the proletarian revolution, and they were robbed of their apparent autonomy, their independence of the great social revolution. The Hungarian shall not be free, nor the Pole, nor the Italian, as long as the worker remains a slave. This is the beginning of the clear necessity of proletarian internationalism. Finally, with the victories of the Holy Alliance, Europe has taken on a form that makes every fresh proletarian upheaval in France directly coincide with a world war. The new French Revolution is forced to leave its national soil forthwith and conquer the European terrain on which alone the social revolution of the 19th century can be accomplished. Thus, only the June defeat has created all the conditions under which France can seize the initiative of the European Revolution. Only after being dipped in the blood of the June insurgents did the tricolor become the flag of the European Revolution, the red flag. And we exclaim, the revolution is dead, long live the revolution. That is actually a badass quote there. I'm just going to say that. You know, you got your tricolor flag, your red, white, and blue. And then it's like, only after dipping it in the blood of the June insurgents did it become a red flag. Where it's like, okay, the bourgeoisie went in and slaughtered their class enemies. And out of it, the tricolor flag has turned into a red flag because the proletariat now has fully emerged. It now truly recognizes its class enemies. And it's flying the red flag. It's not flying the line blue anymore, that's for sure. Absolute fire, yeah. Okay, so that's part one. A reminder that these are a number of different articles published at different times throughout the aftermath of all of this and during by Marx. So this is a different article. It's part 2 from June 1848 to June 13, 1849. Okay. February 25th, 1848 granted the Republic to France. June 25th thrust the revolution upon her. And revolution after June meant overthrow of bourgeois society, whereas before February it meant overthrow of the form of government. The June fight was led by the Republican faction of the bourgeoisie. With victory, political power necessarily fell to its share. The state siege laid, gagged Paris, unresisting, at its feet, and in the provinces there prevailed a moral state of siege, the threatening, brutal arrogance of victorious bourgeoisie and the unleashed property fanaticism of the peasants. No danger, therefore, from below. The peasants were eminently willing to collaborate with the bourgeoisie. The crash of the revolutionary might of the workers was simultaneously a crash of the political influence of the democratic republicans, that is, of the republicans in the sense of the petty bourgeoisie, represented in the Executive Commission by Ledru Rollin, in the Constituent National Assembly by the part of the Montague, and in the press by the Réformeurs. Together with the bourgeois republicans, they had conspired on April 16 against the proletariat. Together with them, they had warred against it in the June days. Thus, they themselves blasted the background against which their party stood out as a power. For the petty bourgeoisie can preserve a revolutionary attitude towards the bourgeoisie only as long as the proletariat stands behind it. The proletarians were dismissed. The sham alliance of the bourgeois republicans, reluctantly and with reservations, concluded with them during the epoch of the provisional government, and the Executive Commission was openly broken by the bourgeois republicans. Spurned and repulsed as allies, they sank down to subordinate henchmen of the tricolor men, from whom they could not wring any concessions, but whose domination they had to support whenever it, and with it the Republic, seemed to be put in jeopardy by the anti-republican bourgeois factions. Later, these factions, the Orleanists and the Legitimists, were from the very beginning in a minority in the Constituent National Assembly. Before the June days, they dared to react only under the mask of bourgeois republicanism. The June victory allowed for a moment the whole of bourgeois France to agree its savior in Cavaignac. And when, shortly after the June days, the anti-republican party regained independence, the military dictatorship and the state of siege in Paris permitted it to put out its antenna only very timidly and cautiously. Since 1830, the bourgeois republican faction, in the person of its writers, its spokesmen, its men of talent and ambition, its deputies, generals, bankers, and lawyers, had grouped itself around a Parisian journal, the National. In the provinces, this journal had its branch newspapers. The coterie of the National was the dynasty of the Tricolor Republic. It immediately took possession of all state offices, of the ministries, the prefecture of police, the post office directorship, the prefectures, the higher army officer posts, which had now become vacant. At the head of the executive power stood its general, Cavaignac. Its editor-in-chief, Marat, became permanent president of the Constituent National Assembly. As master of ceremonies, he at the same time did the honors in his salons of the respectable republic. He's talking right here about the marriage of the class interests of the bourgeoisie and the very direct marriage between it and its organs and the news, right? The bourgeoisie is pumping out its propaganda wholesale, right? If Chomsky had actually ever read Marx, he might find this interesting. Let's just put it like that. I don't trust him to actually have ever read Marx. Even revolutionary French writers, awed as it were by the Republican tradition, have strengthened the mistaken belief that the Royalists dominated the Constituent National Assembly. On the contrary, after the June days, the Constituent Assembly remained the exclusive representative of bourgeois republicanism, and it emphasized this aspect all the more resolutely, the more the influence of the Tricolor Republicans collapsed outside the Assembly. If the question was one of maintaining the form of the bourgeois republic, then the Assembly had the votes of the Democratic Republicans at its disposal. If one of the maintaining the content, then even its mode of speech no longer separated it from the royalist bourgeois factions. For it's in the interest of the bourgeoisie, the material condition of its class rule and class exploitation, that formed the content of the bourgeois republic. Thus it was not royalism, but bourgeois republicanism that was realized in the life and the work of this Constituent Assembly, which at the end did not die, nor was killed, but decayed. For the entire duration of its rule, for as long as it gave its grand performance on stage of the proscenium, and there's a footnote here, here's hoping that tells you what the hell that word is. In the German original, the term Haut and Staatsaktion, principal and spectacular action, main and state action, is used, which has a double meaning. First, in the 17th and first half of the 18th century, it denotated plays performed by German touring companies. The plays are rather formless historical tragedies, bombastic and at the same time coarse and farcical. Second, this term can denote major political events. It was used in this sense by a trend of German historical science known as objective historiography. Leopold Ranke was one of its chief representatives. He regarded Haupt and Stockton as a main subject matter. Back to the text. An unbroken sacrificial feast was being staged in the background. The continual sentencing by courts martial of the captured June insurgents, or the deportations without trial. The Constituent Assembly had the tact to admit that in the June insurgents it was not judging criminals but wiping out enemies. The first act of the Constituent National Assembly was to set up a commission of inquiry into the events of June and of May 15, and into the part played by the Socialist and Democratic Party leaders during these days. The inquiry was directly aimed at Louis Blanc, Ledru-Rollin, and Caussidière. The bourgeois Republicans burned with impatience to rid themselves of these rivals. They could have entrusted the venting of their spleen to no more suitable object than M. Odilon Barrot, the former chief of dynastic opposition, the incarnation of liberalism, the nolite grave, self-important nonentity. The thoroughly shallow person who not only had a dynasty to revenge, but even had to settle accounts with the revolutionists for thwarting his premiership. A sure guarantee of his relentlessness. This Barrot was therefore appointed chairman of the Commission of Inquiry, and he constructed a complete legal process against the February Revolution, which may be summarized thus. March 17, demonstration. April 16, conspiracy. May 15, attempt. June 23rd, civil war. Why did he not stretch his erudite criminologist researches as far back as February 24th. The Journal des Débats inquired, that is, to the foundation of Rome. The origin of states gets lost in the myth that one may believe but may not discuss. Louis Blanc and Costillier were handed over to the courts. The National Assembly completed the work of purging itself, which had begun on May 15th. I think that this is quite obvious, but essentially what Marx is saying here is that, look, the entirety of one cannot actually go in and condemn these men or the revolutionary movement itself without condemning the foundations of this new society, this bourgeois republic. But, you know, these people don't actually care. They don't care at all. So, no big surprise here. Continuing. The plan formed by the provisional government and again taken up by Goujon, what a name, of taxing capital in the form of a mortgage tax was rejected by the Constituent Assembly. The law that limited the working day to 10 hours was repealed. Imprisonment for debt was once more introduced. The large section of the French population that can neither read nor write was excluded from jury service. Why not from the franchise also? Journals again had to deposit caution money. The right of association was restricted. No one fought more fanatically in the June days for the salvation of property and the restoration of credit than the Parisian Petit-Bourgeois, keepers of cafes and restaurants, marchands de vins, wine merchants, small traders, shopkeepers, handicraftsmen, etc. The shopkeeper had pulled himself together and marched against the barricades in order to restore the traffic which leads from the streets into the shop. But behind the barricades stood the customers and the debtors, before it the creditors of the shop. And when the barricades were thrown down and the workers were crushed by the shopkeepers, drunk with victory, rushed back into their shops, they found the interest barred by a savior of property, an official agent of credit, who presented them with threatening notices: overdue promissory note, overdue house rent, overdue bond, doomed shopkeeper. The Petit-Bourgeois, as always, they're not revolutionary themselves, right? They tend to align with their immediate class interests. Now, I'm not saying that every petty bourgeois is incapable of engaging in revolutionary action. In fact, they tend to support all this, right? These are all things fascism did, all things fascism does. If you listen to Michael Parenti's Real Histories of Fascism, for instance, a great short series, he discusses some of the various policies that were pursued under fascism. Petty bourgeois find themselves squarely in this, heedless of their real condition. Now, individual members of the petty bourgeois, from the perspective of us Marxists, you should reach out to them. And you should tell them, listen, your position is constantly dying. It's constantly at threat. The big bourgeoisie, they are elephants while you are mice. And the instant that there is an economic crash, which is always going to happen, you are extremely liable to just being stamped out like that in an instant. You should put your faith and existence in with us, the proletariat, because we have the capacity to lead to a situation where you're not in this sort of situation. Now, very obviously, we have no material capacity to do such, right? Not yet. As the revolutionary movement develops, that may change. But the problem is, you can never let the petty bourgeois lead. They must subordinate themselves to the program. They must identify themselves as proletarians and enter into it. I advocated a diversity of tactics. What that means is also engaging in things like worker cooperatives so that you can fund party operations. It means doing things like venture communism, as what's his name talks about. It means getting investment. It means working with these various groups and so on and so forth. It means bringing in Petit-Bourgeois elements. But those Petit-Bourgeois elements must be dashed away before they ever actually enter into the party itself. You need to have a strong filter which takes all these things and sieves them through and keeps the stuff that's good and gets rid of the stuff that's bad. This is quite obvious, but yeah. The Petit-Bourgeois are flaky, fair-weather allies at the best of times, and they are only allies in the best of times. They are only enemies at any other time, and when their condition is threatened, you'll see what side they end up on, and the side that they will end up on is in their name ultimately, unless you undergo very strict measures for it. And to some degree you understand, right? A lot of these Petit-Bourgeois have maybe spent multiple generations building enough family capital in order to start their little business, right? Or decades of their life. They've spent that in order to build this up, and then they spent hours and hours of their lifeblood into developing this. And then the proletariat comes and says, yeah, no, we're doing a revolution, and everything that you did there, it was all for nothing actually, because we're just overnight abolishing all of that. I would be pissed too. Like, you understand that, right? I would be pissed too, just being told that. So you gotta approach it the right way. And in addition, to be clear, the Petit-Bourgeois are like last on our list. We're targeting the big bourgeois to start with. All the super petty commodity producers and stuff like that, those will dissolve over time as their role in society disappears. This may be multiple generations, right? If somebody's making fur suits, right, you're not going to see a mass demand for these sorts of things. And maybe if you do, it doesn't matter because it'll all be specialized production because each one has to be made specific to that individual person, right? So for a lot of these sorts of pay commodity production, very specialized production, you will retain some sort of petit bourgeois. But you're not going to see stuff like a packing company anymore. That's 2 or 3 people. It's just not efficient. There's no point in keeping that around. Now, with that very long aside about the dangers of the Petit-Bourgeois and our relation to them, let us continue. Salvation of property. But the house they lived in was not their property. The shop they kept was not their property. The commodities they dealt with were not their property. Neither their business, nor the plate they ate from, nor the bed they slept on belonged to them any longer. It was precisely from them that this property had to be saved. For the house owner who left the house, for the banker who discounted the promissory note, for the capitalist who made the advances in cash, for the manufacturer who entrusted the sale of his commodities to these retailers, for the wholesale dealer who had credited the raw materials to these handicraftsmen. Restoration of credit. But credit, having regained strength, proved itself a vigorous and jealous god. It turned a debtor who could not pay out of his 4 walls, together with his wife and child, surrendered his sham property to capital, and threw the man himself into the debtor's prison, which he had once more reared its head threateningly over the corpses of the June insurgents. It's fascism, right? These idiots get themselves behind it, And then they're so deeply surprised when they end up getting fucked from it. And they fall for it every time. Because they can't think long term. They gotta think about their class relations. They gotta think about the realities of the situation. The Petit-Bourgeois saw with horror that by striking down the workers they had delivered themselves without resistance into the hands of their creditors. Their bankruptcy, which since February had been dragging on in a chronic fashion and had apparently been ignored, was openly declared after June. Their nominal property had been left unassailed so long as it was of consequence to drive them to the battlefield in the name of property. Now that the great issue with the proletariat had been settled, the small matter of the épicier could be in turn be settled. In Paris, the mass of overdue paper amounted to over 21 million francs. In the province, to over 1 million. The profiteers of more than 7,000 Paris firms had not paid their rent since February. While the National Assembly had instituted an inquiry into political guilt, going so far as at the back of February, going as far back as the end of February, the Petit-Bourgeois on their part now demanded an inquiry into civil debts up to February 24th. They assembled en masse in the Bourse Hall and threateningly demanded, on behalf of every businessman who could prove that his insolvency was due solely to the stagnation caused by the revolution and that his business had been in good condition on February 24, an extension on the term of payment, by the order of a commerce court and the compulsory liquidation of creditors' claims in consideration of a more moderate percentage payment. As a legislative proposal, this question was dealt with in the National Assembly in the form of concordats à amicable agreements. The Assembly vacillated. Then it suddenly learned at the same time, at the Porte Saint-Denis, thousands of wives and children of the insurgents had prepared an amnesty petition. In the presence of the resurrected specter of June, the Petit-Bourgeois trembled and the National Assembly retrieved its implacability. The amicable agreements, the amicable settlements between debtor and creditor were rejected in their most essential points. Thus, long after the democratic representatives of the Petit-Bourgeois had been repulsed within the National Assembly by the Republican representatives of the Bourgeoisie, this parliamentary breach received its real economic meaning by the Petit-Bourgeois as debtors being handed over to the bourgeois as creditors. A large part of the former were completely ruined, and the remainder were allowed to continue their businesses only under conditions which made them absolute serfs of capital. On August 22, 1848, the National Assembly rejected the amicable agreements. I'm not reading that fucking French. On September 19, 1848, in the midst of the state of siege, Paris Louis Bonaparte and the prisoner of Vincennes, the communist Spell, were elected representative of Paris. We've got a footnote here. The reference is to the by-elections to the Constituent Assembly in Paris on September 17, 1848. To replace 4 deputies, including those who were deprived of their powers after the June insurrection was suppressed. Among the newly elected was the revolutionary socialist Francois Respel, fucking French, imprisoned after the events of May 15, 1848. The bourgeoisie, however, elected the usurious money changer and Orleanist fooled. From all sides at once, therefore, open declaration of war against the Constituent National Assembly, against bourgeois republicanism, against Cavaignac. It needs no argument to show how the mass bankruptcy of the Paris Petit-Bourgeois was bound to produce after effects far transcending the circle of its immediate victims, and to convulse bourgeois commerce once more. While the state deficit was swollen anew by the cost of the June insurrection, the state revenues sank continuously through the hold-up of production, the restricted consumption, and the decreasing imports. Cavaignac and the National Assembly could have recourse to no other expedient than a new loan, which forced them further still under the yoke of the finance aristocracy. because they never even bothered to clean these guys up. They could have, but they decided not to. They decided it was more important to keep the finance aristocracy around rather than making a national bank or something along those lines. While the Petit-Bourgeois had harvested bankruptcy and liquidation by order of court as the fruit of the June victory, Cavaignac's janissaires, the mobile guards, found their reward in the soft arms of the courtesans, and as the, quote, the useful saviors of society, they received all kinds of homage in the salons of Marrast, the knight of the tricolor, who served simultaneously in the amphitryon and the troubadour of the respectable republic. Meanwhile, this social favoritism and the disproportionately higher pay of the mobile guard embittered the army, while all these national illusions with which bourgeois republicanism, through its journal, The National, had been able to attach itself to par of the army, the peasant class under Louis Philippe vanished at the same time. The role of mediator which Cavaignac and the National Assembly played in North Italy in order, together with England, to betray to Austria. This one day of rule destroyed 18 years of opposition on the part of the National. No government was less national than that of the National, none more dependent on England. And under Louis Philippe, the National lived by paraphrasing daily Cato's dictum: Carthage must be destroyed. To those who are not aware, Cato was a Roman general, and every time he entered into the Republic's walls, into the assembly or court or whatever it was called, he would say, even after Carthage was destroyed, he would say, Carthage must be destroyed. It was his calling card. None was more servile toward the Holy Alliance, and from a Guizot the National had demanded the tearing up of the trees of Vienna. Footnote. This refers to a system of general treaties set up by the Congress of Vienna, embracing the whole of Europe apart from Turkey. The Congress decisions helped to restore feudal order, perpetuate the political fragmentation of Germany and Italy, sanctioned the incorporation of Belgium into Holland and the partition of Poland, and outlined measures to combat the revolutionary movement. The irony of history made Bastide, the ex-editor for Foreign Affairs of the National, Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, so that he might refute every one of his articles and every one of his dispatches. For a moment, the army and the peasant class had believed that, simultaneously with the military dictatorship, war abroad and glory had been placed on the order of day in France. But Cavaignac was not the dictatorship of the saber over bourgeois society. He was the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie by the saber, and of the soldier they now required only gendarme. Under the stern features of antique republican resignation, Cavaignac concealed humdrum submission to the humiliating conditions of his bourgeois office. Money has no master. He, as well as the Constituent Assembly in general, idealized this old election cry of the Third Estate by translating into political speech. The bourgeoisie has no king. The true form of its rule is a republic. And the great organic work of the Constituent National Assembly consisted in working out this form and producing a republican constitution. The rechristening of the Christian calendar as a republican one, of the saintly Bartholomew of the saintly Robespierre, made no more change in the wind and weather than this constitution made or was supposed to make in bourgeois society. Where it went beyond a change of costume, it put on record the existing facts. Thus, it solemnly registered the fact of the Republic, the fact of universal suffrage, the fact of a single sovereign National Assembly in place of two limited constitutional chambers. Thus, it registered and regulated the fact of the dictatorship of Cavaignac by replacing the stationary, irresponsible hereditary monarchy with an ambulatory, responsible, elective monarchy with a quadrennial presidency. Thus it elevated no less to an organic law de facto the extraordinary powers with which the National Assembly, after the horrors of May 15 and June 25th, had prudently invested its president in the interests of its own security. The remainder of the Constitution was a work of terminology. The royalist labels were torn off the mechanism of the old monarchy and Republican labels stuck on. Marx, former editor-in-chief of the National, now editor-in-chief of the Constitution, acquitted himself of this academic task not without talent. Isn't all this frickin' familiar? You know, so familiar. It's their playbook doesn't change. Any anarchist or whatever, any baby leftist, let's just put it that way, that says that there's no point in reading these old white guys from 200 years ago. They don't understand the dynamics of capital, the dynamics of class society have not changed. We just keep on seeing the exact same thing over and over again with slightly different packaging. The most slight of packaging that makes it distinct. Time appears as a circle. It appears like nothing ever changes, right? That's the, capitalist realism, right? But in reality, what's happening is it has particular dynamics, and so long as you stay in this mode of production, this is what you're going to get. Just this. It's only when you create a new class society that you get a new condition, right? Of course, our aim is to abolish class society, which will make it so class is no longer the dictating formula for the development of society. I highly recommend, if you've not watched it, the first video of TEX Talks Marx or Capitals Volume 1 through 3 summary. He has an amazing open take on historical materialism, in which he explains it very, very well. I highly recommend it. I don't know if I can actually express it correctly. Anyway, continuing. The Constituent Assembly resembled the Chilean official who wanted to regulate property relations in land more firmly by a cadastral survey, just at the moment when subterranean rumblings announced a volcanic eruption that was to hurl away the land from under his very feet. I have no idea what that is referencing, but okay. While in theory it accurately marked off the forms in which the rule of the bourgeoisie found Republican expression, in reality, it held its own only by the abolition of all formulas, by Faucons's phrase, without any exceptions, by the state of siege. 2 days before it began its work in the Constitution, it proclaimed an extension of the state of siege. Formally, constitutions had been made and adopted as soon as the social process of revolution had reached a point of rest. The newly formed class relationships had established themselves, and the contending factions of the ruling class had recourse to a compromise which allowed them to continue the struggle among themselves, and at the same time to keep the exhausted masses of the people out of it. This constitution, on the contrary, did not sanction any social revolution. It sanctioned the momentary victory of the old society over the revolution. The first draft of the Constitution, footnote, the projet de constitution présent à l'Assemblée nationale drafted by the Commission was submitted to the National Assembly by Marx on June 19, 1848. The draft was published in Le Moniteur Universel. A German translation of the draft was published in the supplement number 24 of the New Rheinstein Zeitung, Marx's newspaper, on June 24, 1848. After the June insurrection, this draft was thoroughly revised by its authors in a conservative spirit. The Constitution of the French Republic was finally adopted on November 4, 1848. first draft of the Constitution, made before the June days, still contained the droit au travail, the right to work, the main clumsy formula wherein the revolutionary demands of the proletariat are summarized. It was transformed into the droit à l'assistance, the right to public relief. And what modern state does not feed its paupers in some form of another? The right to work is, in the bourgeois sense, an absurdity, a miserable, pious wish. But behind the right to work stands the power over capital. Behind the power over capital, the appropriation of the means of production, their subjection to the associated working class, and therefore the abolition of wage labor, of capital, and of their mutual relations. Behind the right to work stood the June insurrection. The Constituent Assembly, which in fact put the revolutionary proletariat hors la loi, outside the law, had on principle to throw the proletariat's formula out of the Constitution, the law of laws, had to pronounce its anathema upon the right to work. But it did not stop there. As Plato banned the poets from his republic, so it banished forever from its republic the progressive tax. And the progressive tax is not only a bourgeois measure, which can be carried out within the existing relations of production to a greater or less degree. It was the only means of binding the middle strata of bourgeois society to the respectable republic, of reducing the state debt, of holding the anti-republican majority of the bourgeoisie in check. Right to work here doesn't mean the American right to work laws. America, for whatever reason, has a very interesting tactic wherein it names its laws as a reverse of what it actually means. But in short, right to work within this case is essentially saying that everybody should have the ability to just go up and demand a job and receive one. It is an attack on the reserve army of labor by the proletariat. The bourgeoisie cannot stand not having a reserve army of labor, so they have to get rid of it. Full employment is an impossibility under capitalism, except in the most short-term of conditions. And usually those short-term conditions are war, wherein it allows them to have a temporary full employment in order to do a bunch of different stuff, but among with it to quell working class discontent, and so on and so forth. But we've not seen full employment since World War II, I think, outside of socialist states, of course. Socialist states. Dictatorships of the proletariat. Let's just put it like that. Continuing. In the matter of the Concordats à l'Amicable, the tricolor Republicans had actually sacrificed the petit bourgeois to the big bourgeois. They elevated this isolated fact to a principle by the legal prohibition of a progressive tax. They put bourgeois reform on the same level as proletarian revolution. But what? Literally America, right? Feeding people. Isn't that just communism? Social democracy, isn't that communism? Taxes, aren't those communism? They put bourgeois reform on the same level as proletarian revolution. But what class then remained as the mainstay of their republic? The big bourgeoisie, and its masses anti-republican, while exploited the republicans in the national order in order to consolidate again the old relations of economic life. It thought, on the other hand, of exploiting the once more consolidated social relations in order to restore the political forms that correspond to them. As early as the beginning of October, Cavaignac felt compelled to make Dufaure and Vivian, previously ministers of Louis Philippe, ministers of the Republic. However, much of the brainless Puritans of his own party growled and blustered. I agree, irony, they do that on purpose to obfuscate what communism is, but I think that ultimately from bourgeois consciousness, they have to go in and associate anything that fetters the development of bourgeois relations as a foreign class assault, even when it ultimately isn't, right? Even if it's in the long-term interests of the bourgeoisie. It's part of the anarchy within bourgeois structures and the factionalism that develops out of it between the different positions on the circuit of capital, between the different long-term and short-term interests, and so on and so forth. This is why parliamentarism is quite possibly the most effective mode of organization for a bourgeois society, because it allows the different factions of the bourgeoisie to peacefully deal with their differences rather than engaging in intercompany war like the ANCAP seem to want for whatever reason. I've never really understood that. But ultimately, that's exactly where it will lead to, because if you want to actually get anywhere, you're going to have to essentially declare war on people who disagree with you within capitalist society. I guess they think that the non-aggression pact will just, stop that from happening. But I don't understand why they think that. But anyway, I actually want to I want to copy this actually and do a comment and say the tactics remain the same. It's always the same shit. Yeah. But it works. It works. Why change a winning strategy, right? Okay. Continuing. While the tricolor constitution, yes, people give up after the first concession. Over and over. The liberals go back to brunch. And, they don't even have to give a concession. They just need to say that they gave a concession, but then actually tighten up even more and then, have the media not to report on it so much. That's what happened with BLM, right? Biden refused literally every single demand that the BLM protesters were calling for. It's incredible. And then increase the amount of suppression and cops on the ground and stuff like that. But the news just stopped reporting on it so much. So all the white liberals just, they stopped thinking about it. And within like the month, BLM seems to have been completely forgotten about. It's frankly hilarious. So how did the dictatorship of the proletariat form in Chile without a revolution differ from those that were formed from a revolution? This is a pretty expansive topic, but in short, in Chile, it was actually a compact of a variety of different parties. Allende's party, I can't remember what it was called, allied with the Christian liberal, basically Christian liberals, bleeding heart liberals, once you get down to it, among some other different factions, and they managed to win the vote. They didn't get a majority of the population, but they got enough. And I would not say that they actually ever formed a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? They did not fundamentally change the basis of state organization. They never smashed the bourgeois state. all the old levers of power remained, all the same organizations remained. It was just ultimately a democratic socialist development. And not to harp too harshly on him, but, he never suborned the military. Maduro, at least in Venezuela, suborned the military, right? He understood that in order to safeguard against a putsch, he would need to get the military on his side, and that's what he did. But Allende never did that. Maduro is ultimately the how shall I say it? He did what Allende wanted to do. That's what Maduro did. Or no, Allende didn't want to do what Maduro did. He did what Allende should have done. I'll let you finish typing here. Apologies for the people in the recording. Go ahead, Anonymous. Oh, okay. Okay, got it. Okay. All right, continuing on. While the tricolor constitution rejected every compromise of the Petit-Bourgeois and was unable to win the attachment of any new social element to the form of government, it hastened, on the other hand, to restore its traditional inviolability to a body that constituted the most hard-bitten and fanatical defender of the old state. It raised the irremovability of judges, which had been questioned under the provisional government, to an organic law. The one king whom it had removed rose again, by score, in these irremovable inquisitors of legality. The French press has analyzed from numerous aspects the contradictions of M. Marast's constitution, for example, the coexistence of two sovereigns, the National Assembly and the President, etc., etc. Hey, listen, divisions of power means more democracy, right? The comprehensive contradiction of this constitution, however, consists in the following. The classes whose social slavery the Constitution is to perpetuate: proletariat, peasantry, petit-bourgeoisie. It puts in possession of political power through universal suffrage. In front of the class whose old social power it sanctions, the bourgeoisie, it withdraws the political guarantees of this power. It forces the political rule of the bourgeoisie into the democratic conditions, which at every moment help the hostile classes to victory and jeopardize the very foundations of bourgeois society. From the first group, it demands that they should not go forward from political to social emancipation. From the others, that they should not go back from social to political restoration. These contradictions perturbed the bourgeois Republicans little, to the extent that they ceased to be indispensable, and they were indispensable only as the protagonists of the old society against the revolutionary proletariat. They fell, a few weeks after their victory, from a position of a party to that of the coterie, and they were treated the Constitution as a big intrigue. What was to be constituted in it was, above all, the rule of the coterie. The president was to be a protracted Cavaignac, the legislative assembly a protracted constituent assembly. They hoped to reduce the political power of the masses of the people to a semblance of power, and to be able to make sufficient play with the sham power itself to keep continually hanging over the majority of the bourgeoisie the dilemma of the June days: realm of the national or realm of anarchy. It's literally the same fucking tactics over and over and over again. This is the tactics of the Democrats. Right? They're right here, right? They're like, listen, we're this is the balancing act between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's 1-to-1. There's no distinction. How does this shit keep on working? How does it keep on working? Oh, man. Gosh. First is tragedy, then is farce. So yeah. right here, right? To the bourgeois Republicans, the democracy within bourgeois society isn't a threat to bourgeois society because it is set up in such a way that it can never be a threat. All the proletarian class interests that enter into the bourgeois state are dashed away and turned into mere semblance of power. And then, in order to distract from this, they go in and they essentially hang over and say, law and order. We've got this big bad guy over here who will do terrible things to you if you don't elect this person. And then that generates consent from the public in order to vote for this person, and that's it. And it keeps on working. It keeps on working. Gosh. The work on the Constitution, which was begun on September 4th, was finished on October 23rd. On September 2nd, the Constituent Assembly had decided not to dissolve until the organic laws supplementing the Constitution were enacted. Nonetheless, it is now decided to bring to life the creation that was most peculiarly its own, the President, on December 4, long before the circle of its own activity was closed. So sure was it of hailing, in homunculus of the Constitution, the son of his mother. As a precaution, it was provided that if none of the candidates received 2 million votes, the election should pass over from the nation to the Constituent Assembly. Futile provisions. The first day of the realization of the Constitution was the last day of the rule of the Constituent Assembly. In the abyss of the ballot box lay its sentence of death. It sought the son of his mother, and found a nephew of his uncle. Saul Cavaignac slew 1 million votes, but David Napoleon slew 6 million. Saul Cavaignac was beaten 6 times over. December 10, 1848, was the day of the Peasant insurrection. Only from this day does the February of the French peasants date. The symbol that expressed their entry into the revolutionary movement, clumsily cunning, knavishly naive, dotishly sublime, a calculated superstition, a pathetic burlesque, a cleverly stupid anachronism, a world historic piece of buffoonery, and an indecipherable hieroglyphic for the understanding of the civilized. This symbol bore the unmistakable physiognomy of the class that represents barbarism without civilization. The Republic had announced itself to this class with the tax collector, announced itself to the Republic with the emperor. Napoleon was the only man who had exhaustively represented the interests and imaginations of the peasant class, newly created in 1789. By writing his name on the frontispiece of the Republic, it declared war abroad and the enforcing of its class interests at home. Napoleon was to the peasants not a person, but a program. With banners, with beats of drums and blare of trumpets, they marched to the polling booths, shouting, "No more taxes! Down with the rich! Down with the Republic! Long live the Emperor!" Behind the Emperor was hidden the peasant war. The Republic that they voted down was the Republic of the rich. As if Napoleon here, the third, was not the fucking rich. Donald Trump. Oh, man. The people lacking class consciousness find themselves attached to some buffoon who is like, oh yes, I absolutely represent you. Is literally one of the fucking fat cats of the aristocracy. Like, it's literally, we should be reading 18th Brumaire, right? We should read that all day. First is tragedy, then it's farce, right? Yes, Napoleon III called himself socialist at one time. This is part of Bonapartism, right? It's going in and saying, all this class struggle, it doesn't actually exist. Let's all just get along. Let's build the proper country on a hill and neither left nor right forward, right? It's the same story over and over again. And it keeps on working over and over again. Oh, man. It's frustrating. I'm just going to say that. It's frustrating that these same tactics keep on working and people keep on falling for them. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Oh, man. I'm laughing, but inside I'm crying. December 10 was the coup d'etat of the peasants, which overthrew the existing government. And from that day on, when they had taken the government from France and given the government to her, their eyes were fixed steadily on Paris. Former active heroes of the revolutionary drama, they could no longer be forced back into the inactive and spineless role of the chorus. The other classes helped to complete the election victory of the peasants. To the proletariat, the election of Napoleon meant the deposition of the Cavaignac, the overthrow of the Constituent Assembly, the dismissal of bourgeois republicanism, the cessation of the June victory. To the Petit-Bourgeois, Napoleon meant the rule of the debtor over the creditor. For the majority of the big bourgeois, the election of Napoleon meant an open breach with the faction of which it had to make use, for a moment, against the revolution, but which became intolerable to as soon as this faction sought to consolidate the position of the moment into a constitutional position. Napoleon, in place of Cavaignac, meant to this majority a monarch, in place of the republic, the beginning of the royalist restoration, a sly hint at Orleans, the fleur-de-lis hidden beneath the violets. Footnote. The lily, the fleur-de-lis, a heraldic emblem of the Bourbon dynasty, the violet, a Bonapartist emblem. Lastly, the army voted for Napoleon against the Mobile Guard, against the peace idol for war. So Napoleon the third here was wanting to get people involved in a war. And the army was angry that the mobile guard was being paid more because they were the counter-revolutionary thugs of the bourgeoisie, and they wanted to keep them fat and happy. But they didn't actually care about the army, which led to the army going in and suiting up with Napoleon. Thus it happened, as the Neue Rheinste Zeitung, Marx's newspaper, stated, that the most simple-minded man in France acquired the most multifarious significance. Just because he was nothing, he could signify everything save himself. Meanwhile, different as the meaning of the name Napoleon might be in the mouths of the different classes, with this name each wrote on his ballot, down with the Party of the National, down with the Cavaignac, down with the Constituent Assembly, down with the Bourgeois Republic. Minister Defer publicly declared in the Constituent Assembly December 10 and this is 2nd February 24th. It's the same thing. Oh, man. Petty bourgeoisie and proletariat had voted en bloc for Napoleon in order to vote against Cavaignac and, by pooling their votes, to wrest a final decision from the Constituent Assembly. The more advanced section of the two classes, however, put forward their own candidates. Napoleon was a collective name of all parties in coalition against the bourgeois republic. Les Drouolin and Raspail were the proper names. The former the Democratic Bourgeoisie, the latter the Revolutionary Proletariat. The votes for Raspail, the proletarians and their socialist spokesman declared it loudly, were to be merely a demonstration. So many protests against any presidency, that is, against the Constitution itself. So many votes against Le Drouolin, the first act by which the proletariat, as an independent political party, declared its separation from the Democratic Party. This party, on the other hand, the Democratic Pays-Bourgeois and its parliamentary representative, Montag, and there's a footnote here, the Jacobins who sat in the Montagne French, or raised seats at the back in the French National Convention which met in Paris in September 1792, treated the candidate culture of Le Droit Rollin with all the seriousness with which it is in the habit of solemnly duping itself. For the rest, this is the last attempt to set itself up as an independent party, as against the proletariat, not only the Republican Bourgeois Party, but also the Democratic Petit-Bourgeoisie and its Montaigne were beaten on December 10th. Montaigne? Better than the way I'm pronouncing it. I'll pick that up. Thanks, Alvin. France now possesses a Napoleon side by side with a Montaigne, proof that both were only the lifeless caricatures of the great realities whose names they bore. Louis Napoleon, with the emperor's hat and the eagle, parodied the old Napoleon no more miserably than the Montaigne, with its phrases borrowed from 1793 and its demagogic proses, parodied the old Montaigne. Thus, the traditional 1793 superstition was stripped off at the same time as the traditional Napoleon superstition. The revolution had come into its own only when it had won its original name. It could do that only when the modern revolutionary class, the industrial proletariat, came dominatingly into its foreground. One can say that December 10 dumbfounded the Montaigne and caused it to grow confused in its own mind, if for no other reason than because that day laughingly cut short with contemptuous peasant jest the classical analogy to the old revolution. On December 20th, Cavaignac laid down his office and the Constituent Assembly proclaimed Louis Napoleon President of the Republic. On December 19, the last day of its sole rule, it rejected the proposal for amnesty for June insurgents. Would revoking the decree of June 27, under which it had condemned 15,000 insurgents to deportation without judicial sentence, not have meant revoking the June ballot itself? Odilon Barrot, the last minister of Louis Philippe, became the first minister of Louis Napoleon. Just as Louis Napoleon dated his rule not from December 10, but from a decree of Senate in 1804, so he found a prime minister who did not date his ministry from December 20th, but from a royal decree of February 24th. Footnote. By decree of the Senate, Senatus Consult, of May 18, 1804, Napoleon I, founder of the Bonaparte dynasty, was proclaimed Emperor of the French. During the February uprising of 1848, King Louis Philippe and the monarchist circles were compelled to make Guizot and other unpopular ministers tender their resignations and tried to form a government of moderate liberals to save the monarchy. On the morning of February 24, Odilon Barrot was authorized to head the cabinet, but Louis Philippe was compelled to abdicate and flee by the victory of popular revolution. The Barrot ministry survived till that afternoon. Continuing. As a legitimate heir of Louis Philippe, Louis Napoleon mollified the change of government by retaining the old ministry, which, moreover, had not had time to be worn out, since it had not found time to embark upon life. The leaders of the royalist bourgeois factions advised him in this choice. The head of the old dynastic opposition, who had unconsciously constituted the transition to the Republicans of the National, were still more fitted to constitute with full consciousness the transition from the bourgeois republic to the monarchy. Odilon Barrot was the leader of one old opposition party, which, always fruitlessly struggling for ministerial portfolios, had not been used up. In rapid succession, the revolution hurled all the old opposition parties to the top of the state, so that they would have to repudiate their old phrases not only in deeds, but even in words, and might finally be flung altogether, combined in a repulsive commixture, on the dung heap of history by the people. And no apostasy was spared this Barrot, this incarnation of bourgeois liberalism, who for 18 years had hidden the rascally vacuity of his mind behind the serious demeanor of his body. If at certain moments the far too striking contrast between the thistles of the present and the laurels of the past startled the man himself, one glance in the mirror gave him back his ministerial composure and human self-admiration. What beamed at him from the mirror was Guizot, whom he had always envied, who had always mastered him, Guizot himself, but Guizot with the Olympian forehead of Odilon. What he overlooked were the ears of Midas. You know, if there's one thing I appreciate with Marx when I'm not reading his freaking notes, it's his bombastic and very entertaining writing. He does have very entertaining writing, and I appreciate it a lot. I'm looking for the end of the chapter, which is quite a ways. Okay, page 59, while we are on page 42. Great. All right. We're not going to be able to get this part done today, but that's okay. We'll keep going until 7. Continuing. The Barat of February 24th became first manifest in the Barat of December 20th. Associated with him, the Orleanist and Voltairian was a legitimist and Jesuit phalanx as the minister of public worship. A few days later, the Ministry of Home Affairs was given to Leon Faucher, the Malthusian, law, religion, and political economy. The Ministry of Barat contained all this and in addition a combination of legitimists and Orleanists. Only the Bonapartist was lacking. Bonaparte still hid his longing to signify Napoleon, for Soloquet did not yet play Toussaint Louverture. The part of the National was immediately relieved of all higher posts, where it entrenched itself. The prefecture police, the post office directorship, the procuratorship general, the mayor's office of Paris were all filled with old creatures of the monarchy. Chagagnier, the legitimist, frickin' French, received the unified supreme command of the National Guard, of the Department of the Seine, of the Mobile Guard, and the troops of the line of the 1st Military Division. Bourgeois, the Orleanist, was appointed commander-in-chief of the Alpine Army. This change of officials continued uninterrupted under the Barat government. The first act of his ministry was the restoration of the old royalist administration. The official scene was at once transformed. Scenery, costumes, speech, actors, supers, mutes, prompters, the position of the parties, the theme of the drama, the content of the conflict, the whole situation. Only the pre-mundane Constituent Assembly remained in its place. But from the hour when the National Assembly had installed Bonaparte, Barat, and Barat-Chagagnier, France stepped out of the period of Republican Constitution into the period of the Constituted Republic. And what place was there for a Constituent Assembly in a Constituted Republic? After the earth had been created, there was nothing else for its creator to do but flee to heaven. The Constituent Assembly was determined not to follow his example. The National Assembly was the last asylum of the party of the bourgeois Republicans. If all levers of executive power had been wrested from it, was there not left to it constituent omnipotence? Its first thought was to hold all circumstances the position of sovereignty it occupied, and then to reconquer the lost ground. Once the Barat ministry was displaced by a ministry of the National, the royalist personnel would have to vacate the palaces of the administration forthwith, and the tricolor personnel would triumphantly move in again. The National Assembly resolved on the attack to overthrow the ministry, and the ministry itself offered an opportunity for the attack, a better one than the Constituent Assembly itself could have invented. Thanks for attending, Zutoka. You saw it there, though. So, continuing. It will be remembered that for the peasants, Louis Bonaparte signified no more taxes. 6 days he sat in the president's chair, and on the 7th, on December 27th, his ministry proposed the retention of the salt tax, whose abolition the provisional government had decreed. The salt tax shares with the wine tax the privilege of being the scapegoat of the old French financial system, particularly in the eyes of the country folk. Remember that refrigeration wasn't a thing back then. And so the way that people kept their food good was by salting it, particularly meats. So this was a pretty devastating attack on the peasantry in particular, who, tended to work on farms. With the salt tax, the Barat ministry could not have put into the mouth of the peasant's choice a more mordant epigram on his electors in the words, "Restoration of the salt tax." With the salt tax, Bonaparte lost his revolutionary salt. The Napoleon of the peasant insurrection dissolved like an apparition, and nothing remained but the great unknown of royalist bourgeois intrigue. And not without intention did the Barras ministry make this act of tactlessly rude disillusionment the first governmental act of the president. The Constituent Assembly, for its part, eagerly seized the double opportunity of overthrowing the ministry and, as against the elected choice of the peasantry, setting itself up as a representative of peasant interests. It rejected the proposal of the finance minister, reduced the salt tax to a third of its former amount, thus increasing by 60 millions a state deficit of 560 millions, and after this vote of no confidence, calmly awaited the resignation of this ministry. So little did it comprehend the new world that surrounded it and its own changed position. Behind the ministry stood the president, and behind the president stood 6 millions who had placed in the ballot boxes many votes of no confidence in the Constituent Assembly by not voting for it. The Constituent Assembly gave the nation back its no confidence vote. Absurd exchange! It forgot that the votes were no longer legal tender. The rejection of the salt tax only matured the decision of Bonaparte and his ministry to finish the Constituent Assembly. There began that long duel which lasted the entire latter half of the life of the Constituent Assembly. January 29th, March 31st, and May 8th are the journeys, the great days of this crisis, just so many forerunners of June 13th. Frenchmen, for example Louis Blanc, have construed January 29th as the date of the emergence of a constitutional contradiction, the contradiction between a sovereign, indissoluble National Assembly born of universal suffrage, and a president who, to go by the wording, was responsible to their assembly, but who, to go by reality, was not only similarly sanctioned by universal suffrage, and in addition united in his own person all the votes that were split up 100 times and distributed among the individual members of the National Assembly, but who was also in full possession of the whole executive power, above which the National Assembly hovered as a mere moral force. This interpretation of January 29th confuses the language of the struggle on the platform, through the press and in the clubs with its real content. Louis Bonaparte, as against the Constituent National Assembly, that was not one unilateral constitutional power as against another. That was not the executive power as against the legislative. That was a constituted bourgeois republic itself as against the intrigues and ideological demands of the revolutionary faction of the bourgeoisie that had founded it, and was now amazed to find that its constituted republic looked like a restored monarchy, and now desired forcibly to prolong the constituent period with its conditions, its illusions, its language, and its personages, and to prevent the mature bourgeois republic from emerging in its complete and peculiar form. As the Constituent National Assembly represented Cavaignac, who had fallen back into its midst, so Bonaparte represented the Legislative National Assembly that had not yet been divorced from him. That is, the National Assembly of the constituted bourgeois republic. The election of Bonaparte could become explicable only by putting in place of the one name its manifold meanings, by repeating itself in the election of the new National Assembly. The mandate of the old was annulled by December 10th. Thus, on January 29th, it was not the President and the National Assembly of the same Republic that were face to face. It was the National Assembly of the Republic that was coming into being and the President of the Republic that had come into being. Two powers that embody quite different periods in the life process of the Republic. The one, the small Republican faction of the bourgeoisie that could alone proclaim the Republic, wrested from the revolutionary proletariat by street fighting and a reign of terror, and drafted its ideal basic features in the Constitution. And the other, the whole royalist mass of the bourgeoisie that alone could rule in this constituted bourgeois republic, stripped the Constitution of its ideological trimmings, and realized by its legislation and administration the indispensable conditions for the subjugation of the proletariat. So what's happened here? At this time, the proletariat is too strong. So what does the bourgeoisie have to do? Well, it has to go to its old enemies, align with them, and enter into wholesale war with the proletariat to suborn them, to convert them into, to discipline them, right? And put them into relations as proletarians. This new royalist faction is bourgeois. To be very clear, it might carry the name of the aristocracy, it might carry the symbols, but it is bourgeois in content and form and everything. Ultimately, this is a form of what we might call a kind of petty accumulation, primitive accumulation. What's going on here is the proletariat has too much power to withhold its labor. And so in order to develop and build up the forces of production and build up the working class that's necessary to actually engage in wage labor, they have to go to war with the peasants. They have to go to war with the proletariat. They have to convert the peasants into proletariat through things like this salt tax, which impoverish them and wrest them from their lands and force them into the cities, where they are put into competition with the proletariat. It's really that simple. And you have these different factions within the bourgeoisie who are, to differing degrees revolutionary. But guess who the revolutionaries are in this? It's the ones that are associated with the monarchy, because they are seeing what is necessary to bring to fruition the full development of the bourgeois mode of production. And so they are saying, no, you need to go and remove your bourgeois ideology in terms of voting rights and all that sort of stuff. And instead, you need to suborn the proletariat. And only then can we talk about anything beyond that. Okay, continuing. The storm, which broke on January 29th, gathered its elements during the whole month of January. The Constituent Assembly wanted to drive the Peasant ministry to resign by its no-confidence vote. The Peasant ministry, on the other hand, proposed to the Constituent Assembly that it should give itself a definite no-confidence vote, decide on suicide, and decree its own dissolution. On January 6, Rateau, one of the more obscure deputies at the order of the ministry, brought this motion before the Constituent Assembly that in August had determined not to dissolve until it enacted a whole series of organic laws supplementing the Constitution. Fold, the ministerialist, bluntly declared that its dissolution was necessary for the restoration of the deranged credit. And did it not derange credit when it prolonged the provisional stage, and with Barat again called Bonaparte in question, and with Bonaparte, the constituted Republic Barat and the Olympian became a raving Roland at the prospect of seeing the premiership he had finally pocketed, which the Republicans had already withheld from him for 10 months, again torn from him after scarcely 2 weeks of enjoyment of it. Barat, confronting this wretched assembly, out-tyrannized the tyrant. His mildest words were, "No future is possible with it," and actually did represent only the past. It is incapable, he added ironically, of providing the Republic with the institutions which are necessary for its consolidation. Incapable indeed. Its bourgeois energy was broken simultaneously with its exceptional antagonism to the proletariat. And with its antagonism to the royalists, its Republican exuberance lived anew. Thus, it was doubly incapable of consolidating the bourgeois republic, which it no longer comprehended, by means of the corresponding institutions. So, this is actually a bad time to leave off, but I'm going to do it anyway. We are rapidly approaching our period. This has actually been a pretty fun session for me. I'm going to pause the recording for now. Does anybody have any last words that they want to give for the recording before I head out? If not, I will simply say thank you for listening. I hope that this session was better than the last. I am still trying to learn, and if you have any recommendations, let me know, and I will do my best to accommodate. I don't expect this to turn into anything more than just these sorts of sessions which don't have, clear stopping points or anything. With that said, have a great night, everybody. Bye.